It's National Clean Air Day today, so what better day to host a researchers cafe all about air pollution in Southampton. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Matt Loxham, who is a BBSRC Future Leader Fellow in Respiratory Biology and Air Pollution Toxicology.
What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is particulate matter, specifically, not so much the gaseous pollutants, and also put into context the research that we've got going on here in Southampton. Now, particulate matter is the component of air pollution that's most linked to damaging health effects. So worldwide it's thought to cause around 3.5 million premature deaths per year. In the UK it's thought to be around 29,000 premature deaths. But I don't really like such numbers, because I think much more important is the effect that these particulates have on non-fatal diseases, on the exacerbations of asthma and heart disease, which are definitely associated with particulate matter. But it doesn't just cause effects on the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, but it causes effects right across the life course. So children born into environments with large amounts of particulate matter are more likely to be born preterm, they're more likely to be born underweight. And as children grow up, approach adolescence, they're more likely to develop asthma and have asthma attacks, have episodes of wheezing, and then moving later into life, lung cancer is associated with particulate exposure, but also there's new associations developing. So there are associations with diabetes and dementia that are being found. We're not quite sure of whether that's causative yet or how that occurs, but it's clear that there are a really wide range of health conditions associated with particulate matter that at the moment we know very little about. So in an attempt to reduce the effects of air pollution, there are guidelines and limits about how much we can be exposed to. So they are set by the EU, there are some guidelines set by the World Health Organization, and the aim is that in time, governments and stakeholders will reduce their emissions so that air quality will reach these so-called legal or acceptable limits. But it's important to understand that these are not safe limits. They are just limits which are desirable and perhaps thought to be feasible to attain. If you look at the limits, their units are in micrograms per cubic metre. So this is the number of micrograms of particulate matter that you can have every cubic metre, and they're usually specified within 24 hours or an average over a year. But there are other ways of measuring particulates and their contents which are not taken into account by these guidelines. And specifically, we're interested in the composition of the particles and the number of the particles. So, composition of the particles is very much dependent on where they come from. And to give you an example, if you look at a diesel car. So a car burning diesel goes past you. What comes out of the exhaust pipe will be diesel exhaust particulate matter. So it's the product of diesel combustion. It has a lot of carbon in there, associated with some associated metals and carbon-based compounds that are produced when the diesel's burnt. Equally, there are non-exhaust particulates which come from the tyres, from the brakes and from the road. And the non-exhaust particles and the exhaust particles are very different chemically and are thought to have very different effects health-wise as well. And yet, when you weigh them and understand how much of them there is in the air, the only thing that matters according to the guidelines is how much they weigh. And the other thing is particle number or particle number concentration. So if you have a diesel car going past, a lot of the particles that come out are what we call ultrafine particles. So they're less than 100 nanometers in diameter. So for reference, that's about 1,000th the width of a hair. They comprise very little of the weight of the particles in the air. So if you were to collect particles from all inside this room, for example, probably about 2 or 3% of the mass of the particles would be these ultrafine particles. But in terms of the number of them, if you were to sort them into their respective size categories, about 95, 96, maybe up to 99% of them will be ultrafines. And ultrafine particles are so small that they can not just get into the depths of the lungs, but penetrate into the circulation as well. And they've been found potentially to have effects on liver, on the brain, and the heart. They're not very well understood. So, with that in mind, we know quite a lot about cars. I've said that there's a lot we don't know, but cars are fairly well characterised. But there are a lot of pollution sources that we don't understand, and some of the work that we've got going on here in Southampton focuses on those. So the first project we have is looking at sources of emissions from ports and from docks. So everyone's obviously heard about ships and how cruise ships come in and they hotel, so they berth and they keep their systems running and they have their auxiliary engines running, so much of what they're burning comes out of their stacks, goes over the city. And that's definitely a health issue, but there are a lot of other sources of pollution within ports as well, and the port is almost a microcosm of a heavily industrialised city. Heavily industrialised cities which are associated with some of the most polluted cities in the world. So there are activities going on in or near the port, such as oil refining, metal handling, there's waste incineration, and these tend to not be considered as much, and they're all concentrated within a very small area, and in Southampton, a very small area where the wind blows the emissions directly over the urbanised areas. So one of the projects we have is to collect particles from different sources around the port. So we've got a device that collects particles in different sizes according to their likely deposition within the lung. We can chemically characterise them, and the idea is to understand more about what different sources there are in the port and how those sources produce different kinds of particles. And then taking that on, we can perform toxicological studies. So we can grow cells that are being pushed out of people's airways in the lab. We can grow them and expose them to particles and measure a variety of outcomes. And the aim is really to try and understand whether certain types of particles and certain components of these particles might pose more of a risk to health than others. So that's one of the things we've got going on. Another project we have going on is to use a smaller device, which actually I've got here. I'll just try and lift it up. The larger device needs a van to carry it, so obvious reasons I didn't bring that. This collects particles on a little filter which is based in this part here. And the idea with this is that if you collect particles each day over maybe 80 to 100, perhaps 150 days, and you understand what the composition of the particles is on each separate day, you can then work out where the particles come from. It uses some quite high-end statistics which have been developed by professional statisticians, but luckily for us there are various analytical tools on computers that we can use without having to fully use the statistical analysis ourselves. It calculates it for us. But we can use that associated with weather information about the prevailing wind, for example, to understand which different sources contribute to the pollution at whichever site this has been situated, and more importantly, how much they contribute. So for example, how much are car exhaust contributing, how much is sea spray contributing, and so on. And the idea of that is to get a better handle on which different sources contribute and which of them are the biggest contributors to pollution around the city and around wherever this device is located. The final project we've got going on is trying to understand a bit more about low-cost pollution sensors, which have really quite immense potential for a better resolution of understanding where pollution is around the city. So some of you may have seen pollution monitoring stations around the city, but there are really not many of them. And the reason that there aren't many of them is because they're so expensive. So the cost of them and also the maintenance cost. You can buy cheaper sensors for 10 or 20, up to maybe a couple of £100. There are some doubts over their performance in certain ways. In some ways they're thought to be good, in some ways less so, but we really haven't got a handle on exactly when they are well performing and when they're not well performing. And so we have a project trying to work out under controlled laboratory conditions how these sensors perform and when they might be better used. Because of course, if you can have a sensor that costs 1/100th of the cost of a council sensor, then you can probably have 100 times as many of them. They might not be suitable for legal purposes, but they might produce data that's good enough to allow us to understand the spread of pollution over cities such as Southampton, but also perhaps just as importantly, cities in the developing world, where they haven't got the infrastructure or the ability to afford really high-end, what we call reference level pollution monitoring equipment. So we've got different projects going on, understanding local and further afield sources of air pollution and their effects on health and contribution to air pollution in general.